The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of machines and the faint sound of nurses talking in the hallway. The walls, pale and cold, seemed to echo with the heaviness in the air. A small dim light hung above the bed, casting soft shadows on the faces of the people who sat beside it. A mother and father, their eyes tired and swollen from tears, sat on one side of the room. Their faces were filled with a deep sadness that no words could ease. On the other side, a young boy sat on a chair, his small hands nervously clutching the edges. His legs dangled just above the floor, not yet long enough to touch it completely. The boy, barely 7 years old, didn't fully understand what was happening. All he knew was that the room felt different, heavier, as though something had changed in the world. His parents had been waiting for months for the baby to come, his baby brother. But now there was no excitement, no joy. The small bundle that his mother had held so dearly just hours before now lay still in the crib beside the bed. He glanced at his parents, unsure of what to do. His mother, usually so strong, now seemed small and broken, tears still wet on her cheeks. His father sat with his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on the crib, as if he could make the sadness disappear if he stared at it long enough. The boy's older sister, who was sitting quietly beside him, gently took his hand in hers, squeezing it in a way that was meant to comfort him. Her eyes were full of emotion, but she didn't speak. It was as if there were no words to explain this kind of pain. "Your brother isn't coming home," she whispered, her voice shaky. The boy looked at her, trying to understand, but he didn't fully grasp what she meant. "He's not going to be with us," she continued, her voice barely audible. He didn't survive." The boy felt a chill run through him, as if the room itself had frozen. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat quietly, his heart pounding in his chest. His sister looked at him with a sad smile, brushing a few strands of hair from his face. She knew he was confused, just like their parents. But this was something he would have to understand, even if it hurt. The small body of his brother lay in the crib, wrapped in a white blanket. It looked so peaceful, so still. The boy didn't know what death was, but he could feel something in the air, something different. He didn't know how to say goodbye. He reached out to touch his brother's tiny hand, but pulled back, unsure. He felt like he shouldn't be there, like his brother needed to be alone in this moment. Yet, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the stillness that filled the room. It was then that his sister spoke again, her voice softer this time. "It's okay, you know. You can say goodbye." The boy nodded slowly, as if he understood. He stood up from his chair, his feet almost too small for the weight of the moment. He walked slowly toward the crib, the world around him muffling into silence, and leaned over to look at his brother's face one last time. He reached out gently, running his fingers along the edge of the blanket. His baby brother, so small and fragile, seemed like a dream now, a dream that was already slipping away. A quiet sadness filled his chest, a deep sadness that made his throat tighten. With a deep breath, the boy whispered, almost to himself, "Goodbye, little brother." It wasn't much, but it was all he had. And for a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath with him. The boy stood there, his small feet barely making a sound as he looked down at his brother's lifeless body. He felt like he was standing in the middle of a dream that didn't make any sense. His heart ached in a way he couldn't understand, and his throat felt tight. He had never felt so helpless, so lost. The stillness in the room seemed to close in on him, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. His eyes flickered over to his parents, who were still sitting silently on the other side of the room. His mother had her hands clasped in her lap, her face pale and tired, as though she hadn't slept in days. His father, usually a figure of strength, was staring at the crib with a blank expression. The boy noticed the way his father's shoulders seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 thoughts, his face a mix of pain and disbelief. He knew that his parents loved the baby deeply, and now they had to say goodbye too. His older sister, who had been so calm up until now, was standing by the window, her back turned to him. She had always been the strong one, the one who knew how to make everything feel okay, but even she was struggling to hold back the tears. The boy felt a wave of sadness wash over him again. He had never seen his family like this before, and it was hard for him to accept. How could he understand something so big, so final, when he was still so small? The room was too quiet. It felt like all the noise and life had been sucked out of it, leaving behind only the uncomfortable silence of grief. The boy turned back to the crib, his little hands trembling as he reached out again, this time a little more carefully, to touch his brother's hand. His fingers brushed the soft fabric of the blanket. It felt cold to the touch, like the warmth had already left. He tried to picture what his brother would have looked like if he had been alive, if he had been able to see his brother's face light up with laughter, to hear his tiny voice. But those thoughts felt far away, like something that could never happen. His heart ached even more at the thought. The boy knew that life was full of things he didn't understand, things like sadness, like death. But today, in this moment, those things felt bigger than anything he could wrap his mind around. He wanted to cry. He wanted to shout, or scream, or do anything to make the sadness go away. But he didn't know how. "Do you want to say something else to him?" His sister's voice interrupted the silence, soft but gentle. She had come closer, her eyes red from crying, but there was a kindness in her voice that made the boy look up at her. He swallowed hard, his lips trembling as he shook his head. He didn't know what to say. Words didn't seem to fit this moment. All he could do was stand there, feeling the weight of the room, feeling the heavy silence that hung in the air. But his sister didn't push him. She simply stood by his side, her arm wrapping around his shoulder, offering comfort without saying a word. The boy glanced at his parents again, seeing the way his mother's tears had dried up, leaving only the quiet pain in her eyes. His father finally stood up, walking slowly to the crib, his face filled with emotion that he couldn't hide anymore. For the first time, the boy saw his father's shoulders sag, as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with him. His mother reached out and gently held his father's hand, and together they stood, side by side, in silence. The boy could feel that this was a moment he would never forget. It was a goodbye, but it didn't feel like it was the end. Somehow, even in the midst of all this sadness, the boy knew that something had changed in the room. The weight of grief was still there, but there was a sense of peace too, a feeling that somehow they had all said what needed to be said. The boy stood quietly, his heart heavy in his chest, as he continued to look down at his brother. The room felt colder now, even though the air conditioning had been turned off long ago. It was the kind of cold that didn't come from the temperature. It was the kind of cold that came from the silence, the kind that hung thick in the air, making everything seem distant and unreal. He felt the weight of it pressing on him, making it harder to breathe. The quiet was too much. Then something inside him seemed to shift, a deep, sorrowful cry rising from deep within his chest. It wasn't like the boy had planned it. It wasn't something he could control. The cry left his throat without warning, raw and filled with the weight of the grief that had built up inside him. He hadn't even realized he was holding back tears until the sound came out, soft but loud enough to fill the still room. The cry was a sound of pure sorrow, a sound that felt too big for a boy his age to make. The moment the cry left him, everything in the room stopped. It was like someone had pressed the pause button on time. The boy's parents froze, their faces caught in mid-expression. His father, who had been standing near the crib, was no longer moving. His mother, who had been wiping her eyes, was as still as the walls. Even his sister, who had been standing just behind him, seemed to have stopped moving, her hand suspended in midair. Everything was frozen, locked in time. It was as though the whole world had stopped spinning, held in place by the boy's cry. The boy, still standing over his brother, looked around in confusion. His breath came in shallow gasps as he took in the scene. His mother's face was frozen in that moment of pain, her eyes still wide from the shock of his cry. His father's hand had been reaching out toward him, but was now caught in midair. His sister, too, was completely still. The boy tried to speak, to call out to them, but no sound came from his mouth. It was as though the world had muted itself. For a moment, the boy stood there, unsure of what to think. He hadn't meant to make time stop, hadn't meant to freeze everything around him. The cry had been an accident, a release of all the sadness and confusion he didn't know how to express. And now it felt like he had done something wrong, like he had caused this strange, uncomfortable stillness. But the room was completely silent, no one moving, no one breathing. He stepped away from the crib, his feet dragging slowly across the floor, his small body feeling strange in the frozen space. He didn't know how long the stillness would last or why it had happened. He looked back at his parents, their faces still unchanged, as if caught in a moment of time that they couldn't escape. Suddenly, as if the room had taken a deep breath, the world around him began to shift again. The quiet hum of the machine started back up, low and mechanical. His sister's hand fell to her side, and his parents slowly started to move again, though they still appeared dazed, unsure of what had just happened. The boy felt a strange calm wash over him, almost as if the cry had done something important, something that made everything in the room feel different. His father blinked, looking around at everyone with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. His mother blinked too, her face slowly starting to soften as the tension in the room started to ease. The boy looked at them, still unsure of what to say. They hadn't spoken yet, and he wasn't sure how to explain what had just happened. It was as though no one knew how to react to the stillness, or the cry that had broken it. For a moment, there was only the sound of the machines, the steady beep of the heart monitor, and the deep silence between them. But the boy felt a strange peace inside him, a feeling that his cry had done something he didn't understand, but something that made the room feel just a little less heavy. The room seemed to hold its breath, and everything around the boy felt surreal. It was as though time itself had taken a pause. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had imagined the whole thing, the stillness, the cry, the way everything had frozen in place. But he knew it wasn't a dream. His sister's hand had been right in front of him, suspended in the air like a frozen moment captured in time. His mother's eyes, wide with grief, hadn't moved an inch. His father's hand had been reaching for him, but it was now stuck in the air as if caught by an invisible force. The boy, still standing in the middle of the room, tried to make sense of what had just happened. He felt small, like an innocent child who had somehow caused something big and impossible to understand. He looked around at his family, each of them motionless, caught in the strange stillness of the room. The silence pressed in on him, almost too loud, like a weight sitting heavily in the air. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and quick, but the rest of the world seemed muted, locked in place. His mind raced with confusion. Could he have caused this? He didn't know how or why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his cry had been the reason for this strange freeze in time. His heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel his palms sweating. He had never felt more alone in his life, surrounded by his family, but unable to reach them, unable to speak. The world outside of this room felt distant and unreachable, like it didn't exist anymore. He glanced at his baby brother again, lying so still in the crib, untouched by the strange pause in time. The boy's chest tightened as he thought about how it was his last moment with his brother, and now it felt like he had disturbed something by crying out. But as he stood there, lost in his thoughts, a small shift happened. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in the air, like the world had taken a quiet breath. The machines in the corner of the room started to hum again, the soft whirring of the ventilator filling the silence. Slowly, his sister's hand began to fall to her side, the stillness breaking as her fingers moved with a slow grace. The boy stared, wide-eyed, as his parents' expressions slowly began to shift. His mother blinked, and her face relaxed, though she still appeared tired and sad. His father's hand, which had been frozen in the air, lowered gently to his side, and he seemed to shake himself from the moment of stillness, his gaze falling to the boy with a mixture of confusion and concern. The boy didn't know how to explain what had happened, or even if he should. It felt like everything had happened so quickly, so strangely, that there were no words for it. He waited, his heart still beating loudly in his ears. The room was beginning to feel normal again, but it was as if something had shifted in the air, something that hadn't been there before. A sense of calm had settled over him, even as his parents began to speak in hushed tones, unsure of what to make of what they had just experienced. The boy didn't understand how or why, but the moment felt different. It felt like the room had heard him, that his cry had reached something deeper than he could ever grasp. For a long moment, no one spoke, and the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was peaceful, as though something had been acknowledged, even if no one quite knew what it was. The boy still felt a little lost, but there was a sense of quiet understanding between them all now. His father reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a small, comforting squeeze. His mother wiped the last of her tears away, looking at him with a soft, almost grateful expression. The boy met his parents' eyes, and even though they didn't have all the answers, they shared a connection in that quiet moment. And somehow, though the room was still heavy with grief, the boy felt a little less alone. He didn't have all the answers, but he understood, in his own small way, that his cry had been heard, and that he was not the only one holding onto the memory of his brother. They were all holding onto it together. As the minutes passed, the boy couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered in the room. His family had returned to their quiet routines, but there was an undeniable change in the air. The room, once filled with sorrow and confusion, now felt different, warmer, somehow. It was still heavy with grief, but there was also a strange sense of peace. It was as if the boy's cry had broken something open, something that hadn't been spoken or understood before. He stood quietly by the crib, his hands still trembling slightly as he looked at his baby brother. His mind was racing with thoughts he didn't have the words for. What had happened? Why had everything frozen? Could his cry have somehow changed things? He didn't know, but there was something he couldn't quite explain that filled the space around him. Something had been acknowledged, and though it was unclear what exactly had happened, it felt as if his cry had bridged a gap between the world of the living and the world beyond. The boy wasn't sure how long he stood there, but he finally turned to face his parents. His father was sitting in the chair again, his hand resting on his knee, and his mother was wiping her face with a tissue. They hadn't spoken much since everything had returned to normal, but there was a shared understanding between them all now, even if they couldn't put it into words. They didn't need to say anything to each other. They all knew that this moment had been unlike anything they had ever experienced. The boy's sister had moved away from the window and was standing near the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She glanced at him and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She hadn't said much, but there was something in her eyes that told the boy she understood too. They didn't have the answers, but somehow they were all connected by the silence that had come after his cry. It was as if the room had listened, as if everything that had been left unspoken had been acknowledged in a way they couldn't explain. For the first time that day, the boy felt a sense of calm wash over him. The confusion that had plagued him earlier had begun to fade, replaced by something quieter, more peaceful. It wasn't an end to the sadness. It was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. But it was as though the world had given them a moment to breathe, a moment to say goodbye in their own way, without words, without expectations. Just a simple acknowledgement that they had been there together. And that was enough. As he looked at his parents, the boy felt something stir deep inside him. A sense of connection, a feeling that they had all experienced something together that had shifted the weight of the day. It was as though the cry he had made had broken down the walls that had separated them, allowing them to understand each other on a deeper level, even without speaking. His mother finally looked up at him, her eyes still sad but softer now. She gave him a small, tired smile and reached out to touch his cheek. The boy leaned into her touch, grateful for the comfort, even though the sadness was still there. His father stood up and walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of quiet support. The boy didn't need to say anything. He could feel the unspoken understanding between them all. It was as if they had found a new way to connect, a way to share the pain without needing to explain it. And though the sadness was still present, it didn't feel as heavy as it had before. It was as though, in that moment, they had shared something together, something that had brought them closer, even in the face of loss. The boy finally took a deep breath and looked back at the crib, where his brother lay still and quiet. There was no more confusion, no more questions. He didn't understand everything, but he understood this. He had said goodbye, and that was enough. The room felt peaceful now, like a calm after a storm, and as his family gathered around him, he knew that, somehow, they would carry this moment with them always. As the boy stood quietly in the room, he could feel the weight of the moment still hanging in the air, but it was no longer suffocating. The sadness was still there, a deep, aching emptiness in his chest. But now there was something else too, a sense of calm that he hadn't felt before. It was as though the cry he had made had cleared the air in a way that words never could. The room, which had once felt heavy with grief, now seemed to hold a quiet understanding. It was peaceful, and though the sadness hadn't disappeared, there was no longer a feeling of being lost in it. His parents sat together, side by side, both staring at the crib. His mother's hand rested on his father's arm, and the boy could see how tired they were. But he also saw something else, something that had been missing before. There was a bond between them now, a shared connection that hadn't been there earlier. It was as though the stillness had allowed them to speak without words, to understand each other without having to explain. The boy's sister had moved away from the door and was standing by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She had been so quiet throughout the whole experience, but now the boy saw a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She didn't need to say anything. The way she stood, her eyes slightly downcast, told him that she understood. She had been affected by the silence, just like him, just like their parents. They had all been a part of this strange, unspoken moment. The boy felt the air around him shift again, this time not from fear or confusion, but from a deep, quiet understanding. It was like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, though the grief was still there, still something they all carried. But now, it wasn't something they were carrying alone. They had all been through something together, something they would remember forever, even if they couldn't explain it. He looked down at his brother one more time. The small, still body in the crib didn't look any different, but somehow the boy felt that his brother was still with him. It wasn't something that could be explained. He couldn't put it into words, but he knew. It was a feeling, a presence that went beyond what his eyes could see. His brother, though gone from the world, was still there in a way that words could never capture. The boy's mother slowly stood up, her eyes never leaving the crib. She reached out a hand toward the boy, and he stepped toward her without thinking, as if drawn by an invisible thread. She pulled him close, holding him tight as though she never wanted to let go. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it was filled with love and comfort. "It's okay," she said. "We're going to be okay." The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand what she meant. But in that moment, it didn't matter. He felt safe in his mother's arms, and the world outside of that hospital room felt distant. It felt like time had slowed, and in the quiet of the room, they could all breathe again, if only for a moment. His father joined them, and the three of them stood together, close, connected. The boy felt a sense of unity that he hadn't felt before. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, and the boy felt the weight of his love, of his presence, anchoring him in a way that made the world outside the room seem a little less frightening. The boy's sister finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "We'll always remember him," she said, her words simple but filled with meaning. "He'll always be with us." The boy didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, surrounded by his family, he felt like he wasn't alone. Whatever happened next, whatever the world held for them, they would face it together. and somehow that gave him the strength to carry on, knowing that the bond they shared, the love they had for each other and for the brother they had lost, would never fade. The days following the strange moment in the hospital room seemed to pass slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. The boy couldn't quite explain it, but it was as if time had stretched out after that moment when everything had frozen. His family had returned to their lives, but nothing felt the same. The weight of the loss was still there, but it was different now. They were all still adjusting to the grief, but there was a sense of quiet strength that had settled over them. They hadn't forgotten, and they never would, but somehow they were moving forward together. At night, the boy would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. He thought about his brother, the tiny face that he would never get to see smile, and the life that had been lost before it even really began. His heart ached with sadness, but there was also something else, something he couldn't fully name. A feeling that maybe his brother hadn't really left them. It wasn't something he could explain to anyone, but it was there, deep inside him. It was as if, in some way, his brother was still with him, not in a physical way, but in a way that he felt in his heart. The boy often found himself going back to that moment in the hospital room, when his cry had filled the space, when the world had stopped, and everything had changed. He didn't understand why it had happened, or what it meant, but it was something he couldn't shake. It felt as though, in that cry, something had been said, something beyond words. He couldn't make sense of it, but he knew that it had been real. It had been important. His parents, too, seemed to be carrying the memory with them, though they didn't talk about it much. They had their quiet moments, sitting together with no words, simply sharing the grief. But there were also moments of lightness, of laughter. They found small joys in each other, in their everyday routines, in the little things that kept them grounded. And though they still carried the weight of their loss, they were healing, little by little. The boy's sister, too, had been different. She was still quiet, still distant at times, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She spent more time with him now, sometimes sitting in silence with him, just being present. There were no grand conversations, no big gestures, but there was a shared understanding between them. They didn't need to say everything. They knew what the other felt without needing to speak. One afternoon, a few weeks after they had said their goodbyes in the hospital, the boy was sitting by the window in his room, looking out at the quiet world outside. It was a clear day, the sun shining bright, and for the first time in a while, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He thought about his brother, still feeling that same connection he had felt in the hospital room. It wasn't something he could explain, but he felt it deeply in his chest. He didn't know if anyone else felt it, but it was there for him. His mother came into the room, sitting beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just sat quietly next to him, as if she, too, was lost in her thoughts. After a while, she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to miss him," she said softly. "We all miss him, but he'll always be a part of us." The boy nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I know," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I think he's still with us, somehow." His mother smiled, her eyes softening. "I think so too," she said, her voice full of warmth. "And in our hearts, he always will be." The boy didn't know what the future held or what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this: he was not alone. His family, though broken, was healing together, and the love they shared for the brother they had lost would always remain. And as he sat there, surrounded by his family, he felt that connection to his brother more strongly than ever. He didn't need to understand it completely. He just needed to believe in it, and that was enough. As the days went by, the grief didn't disappear, but it became a little easier to bear. It wasn't that the boy forgot his brother. It was that he had found a way to carry the love for him without being overwhelmed by the sadness. The memory of that moment in the hospital room would stay with him forever, and it would continue to shape the way he understood the world. In the silence, in the stillness, in the grief, There had been a deeper understanding that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The days turned into weeks, and the boy found himself adjusting to life in a way that surprised him. Though the sadness hadn't completely disappeared, it didn't feel as overwhelming anymore. His family had found their rhythm again, moving through each day with quiet strength. There were still moments of deep sorrow, moments when they would all sit together, remembering the brother they had lost. But there were also moments of lightness, moments when they would laugh together or simply enjoy the silence of being near each other. The boy's thoughts often wandered to his brother, especially when the house was quiet and the world outside seemed still. He would catch himself smiling sometimes, remembering the feeling of holding his brother's tiny hand, even if it had only been for a short time. He couldn't explain it, but it was like a quiet presence surrounded him. It was as if his brother had left a piece of himself behind, a piece that the boy could still feel. It wasn't something he could touch or see, but it was there, deep inside him. One evening after dinner, the boy was sitting on the porch with his father. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over everything. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that came from understanding that even though things weren't perfect, they were moving forward. His father sat beside him, not saying anything at first. There was no need for words, not right now. They both simply enjoyed the quiet, the company of each other. After a few minutes, his father cleared his throat and spoke. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice soft but steady. "How are you feeling?" The boy thought for a moment. He had been quiet, hadn't he? It wasn't that he had anything to hide, but he had been processing everything in his own way. He wasn't sure how to explain the feeling of connection he still had with his brother, the feeling that he wasn't truly gone. But he knew his father understood without needing to say much. "I think about him a lot," the boy said, his voice a little hesitant at first, but growing steadier with each word. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's like he's still with us. Not in the way we can see, but in a way we can feel." His father smiled, his eyes softening with understanding. "I feel it too," he said quietly. "It's something we all carry inside us, even when we can't see him. And that's okay. We carry him with us in our hearts." The boy nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. It was comforting to know that his father shared the same feeling, that they weren't the only ones who carried the memory of his brother. It felt like a bond they would always have, something that would remain between them, even as life moved forward. The next few days were filled with the usual routines: school, homework, family meals. But there was something different. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. The boy felt a quiet strength within himself, a new understanding of the world. He didn't have all the answers, but he had found a way to accept the loss, to carry it with him without it completely defining him. He understood now that grief wasn't something you could just move past. It was something you carried with you, something that became a part of who you were, and that was okay. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, the boy found himself looking around at his parents, his sister, and the empty space where his brother should have been. It was a bittersweet feeling, but it wasn't painful anymore. He felt like his brother's spirit was there, in the quiet of the house, in the love they all shared. They would always remember him, and that memory would live on in each of them. The boy realized that life would go on, as it always did. There would be hard days and moments of sadness, but there would also be moments of joy and peace. And as long as they remembered his brother, as long as they carried him with them, he would never truly be gone. In the end, the love they had for him would always be a part of who they were, a love that would last forever, no matter what the future held.